Desperate measures. Burning ashes choked visibility as easily as life, as an inferno raged through what could barely be recognized as a village, each passing second further obscuring sight and definition. Gawain advanced. Without lungs, he did not need to fight for the oxygen greedily claimed by the blaze. Without flesh, the licking tongues of flame found no purchase, no easy fuel to reproduce with. The foes he sought were similarly unhindered, as had they had grown to maturity in an environment far more hostile, far more antithetical to human life. Demons. They could only be called that. For how else could one comprehend the blasphemously protean entities, consistently only in hostility, in corruption of natural rhythm and function, in imperative threat and inevitable desecration? Teeth, eyes, limbs, and claws recognizable only in relation to where they should not be. He had left fear behind with flesh. The duty to which he was now bound was more oppressive and inescapable than even death could assert. He had given his life, his soul's very redemption, in a bargain, a bid, a desperate bet to save his people. In this place, against the towering forms that emerged from the crumbling husk of what had been someone's home, the sanctuary against the outside, it felt almost like it might have been worth the sacrifice, though the goal had been made a laughing mockery of in the long years since he had drawn breath. His gaunt frame still persisted, moving with speed and precision that should not be possible for a creature without muscles or nerves. A skeletal hand twitched before accelerating through the demon's center of mass with a burst of visceral gore. The other hand struck like a bullet as the first withdrew, before a hard kick dislodged the creature, striking the ground with a thump barely perceptible above the howling bonfire. The town should now be clear, the block ahead the last sector that had yet to be swept, and as the buildings burned closer to the ground, the potential for ambush diminished as the fires began to recede for the first time since the first torch had been laid. The loss of the infrastructure was regrettable, but a necessary result of the exposure, the influence, the infestation of this region. This too was another factor anchoring his choice. As he confirmed the area clear, he recalled. Demons tainted all they touched, and humanity was no exception. Those who were not physically corrupted by bite, touch, or toxin were warped by exposure, as malign thoughts and urges took root in the psyche, invariably exhibiting in the individuals conducting vile deeds that wrought a conduit to further demonic influence, left unchecked, cascading into mass possession and physical manifestation. That's why the first contact had spread so rapidly, and why attempts by the kingdom's armed forces to respond had deteriorated into a series of desperate suicide missions, tragic last stands, and valiant feints to obscure what pockets of civilization remained. Only the Black Forest stood, a solitary bastion that had asserted itself unbreachable. The castle itself was not even listed on official maps of the kingdom, appearing if at all as a vague feature simply labelled ruins. With the emergence of the demonic mass, the reason for the area's distinct lack of occupation was made clear. The land was the home of another horror, one whispered of to wayward children to keep them in after dark, to stop them from inviting a stranger into their home when nobody else was around or awake. A vampire. Gawain had confirmed this to be what it truly was with chilling certainty, having encountered the creature for the first time after a desperate retreat from his hometown. He had glimpsed it first during the skirmish as they reached the threshold of the crumbling mound in which they sought shelter, unrecognizable as anything more than a flash of white motion in the moonlight. His attention was more immediately drawn to the nightmares pursuing them, as he realized he was the last one from the village still running. The rearguard had just been cut down by a pair of cackling abominations, grabbing and devouring flesh even as they continued to hurtle toward his position. He turned and steeled his spine to buy time for those ahead, but as he braced his spear, he watched as the creatures began to slow their ravenous pace, as the visibility between him and them began to decrease. Shapes began to solidify in his vision as he watched the ground burst open and the wretched forms of the dead rise to block the demon's passage. A sharp crack came from above as the first story collapsed, and a chunk of rubble struck Gawain into unconsciousness. He awoke in darkness, numb at first, and feeling a sensation filtered in. Pain. He was in an incredible amount of pain. Pulsing fire from his core, throbbing agony white-hot against his temples. Faintly, he recognized a voice. It was hard to make out clearly, in a scratchy whispered tone that suggested perhaps an aeon or more had passed since last it was used. "Brave," came the voice. Silence followed as Gawain struggled to respond. Something was wrong with his lungs. Badly wrong. He coughed and felt something solid shift within him, followed by a fresh wave of pain. "I was brave once," the voice continued, "and I died for it. You are dying now. I cannot save you, but I can preserve you." The voice spoke more fluently with time, but Gawain recoiled instinctively at the suggestion. The creature must have sensed it as it spoke again. "I will not make you as I am. I dwell here alone by choice and by will. My curse will die with me, but I have learned much in the long dark years. I offer to bind your soul to your frame. It will not save you from death, but it will preserve your mind." Gawain coughed again, more weakly this time, but managed to marshal enough breath to respond. "What cost?" he asked the creature. "I cannot say for certain. I have never bound a willing mortal soul before, but circumstances have changed. I am not the only monster at the door. You will not eat again, nor sleep, nor feel the warmth of flesh. I have forgotten these things in truth, so I cannot know how you value them." Gawain thought on this. If the creature spoke true, and he had sensed no deceit in his words so far, this was his only chance to protect his people. Would they be able to appreciate that? Or would they just see another monster? "Do it," he whispered, unable to even rally another deep breath, body ragged with exhaustion and collapse. Pain overwhelmed him, his last conscious recollection of a rhythmic chanting coupled with an otherworldly pulse that illuminated things the living eye could not clearly see. The following night, he rose again. At least part of him did. Bones tore wetly from sinews and flesh as his skeletal body reanimated, discarding the viscera of his mortality. Gawain was surprised first by how upset he was not, expecting the grisly sight to be accompanied by a flood of adrenaline that never came. He did not feel sad or angry, only aware, new senses seamlessly replacing his atrophied sensory organs. Interaction was a slower lesson, as he did not move with the same momentum and had lost muscle memory. Every movement now needed to be thought about, planned, and executed with deliberate intent. He could speak, although he was not sure how. He opened his mouth with the intent to talk, and words followed, echoing forth without lips or tongue to shape them. Over the following weeks, Gawain spoke to the creature when he could. He was told that the other survivors of the village had sought shelter in the castle and were kept secure by the creature and its undead servitors. He learned the creature's name, Carmen, and in exchange for his own history and what he knew of the demonic outbreak, he heard how Carmen came to be the thing he was now, lost or searching for their sister in these very woods, 1,000 years or more hence, of how they were taken and tormented by the foul thing that lurked here, of the dark embrace that cursed Carmen to shelter forever for the sun, thirsting for the blood of the living, of how he learned to master his obsession, eventually slaying the monstrosity that had enslaved him, and of his long quest to muster the dark knowledge that his progenitor had gained, searching for a way back, of the many failed experiments leading to the same incontrovertible outcome. There was no way back. Once dead, once damned, the only way out was total obliteration. A decade passed, and the small refuge grew as survivors from other directions were absorbed by the pocket of relative safety. Gawain patrolled during the day, and Carmen kept the settlement protected after dusk, with his mindless dead in constant standby against incursion of force. As others from the village fell in combat or to natural means, a tradition emerged. The dying were given the choice to pass on or to serve as guardian in death. 10 years of service became the standard contract, with the option to pass on or to renew given at the end. Most chose to serve, although only once in the majority of cases. Gawain had endured for 150 years. Over this time he had learned to bind souls, sharing the knowledge Carmen offered, to give his people a chance at protection. Around him he had gathered a band of dedicated dead, souls who had refused the offer of oblivion in favour of further struggle. Carmen had disappeared about 30 years ago, passing on the last of his teachings before walking into the night with the intention of striking back at the heart of the demonic mass. Frustrated with their slow rate of progress, Gawain had been tempted to follow, but had resolved on a more sustainable approach. Rather than charging in unsupported, he had begun to lay the groundwork for a systemic reclamation, an unstoppable advance anchored by the immovable dead. From their initial foundation, they had carved a wedge into lands formerly overrun by the demonic and monstrosity, scouring and reclaiming the land for settlement. In each outpost, those who had fallen in losing and in retaking the ground had been raised to stand sentinel. They were close now, only a few kilometres between the tip of the advance and the capital, host of the initial outbreak and, hopefully, the source of the corruption. Much work would be needed to close the final gap, to support advance into the city proper, and given the intensity with which resistance had mounted this far in, the final stretch would be brutal beyond imagining. The end.